Tonight on KQED Newsroom, California gas prices have hit record highs and they keep climbing. We speak with Assemblymember James Gallagher about Republican calls to repeal California's gas tax. And Governor Newsom delivered his State of the State address this week. We'll talk through the highlights with our panel of reporters. Plus, we take an in-depth look at California's housing crisis with the co-hosts of KQED's hit podcast, Sold Out, Rethinking Housing in America. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco this Friday, March 11th, 2022. Hello and welcome to the show. This is KQED Newsroom and I'm Priya David Clemens. Gas prices have risen by leaps and bounds since the start of the war. California usually imports only a fraction of our oil from Russia, but the instability in the global oil market has driven prices up everywhere. On Friday, the average price of a gallon of regular unleaded in California was $5.72, according to AAA. Some economists predict the average cost could push into the $6 or even $7 range in the weeks ahead if Russian aggression continues in Ukraine. In his State of the State speech on Tuesday night, Governor Newsom said he's working towards a gas tax rebate.
Look, no one's naive about the moment we're living in, with high gas prices and the geopolitical uncertainty that's fueling them. In January, we proposed a pause to the gas tax increase. Now, it's clear we have to go farther. And that's why, working with legislative leadership, I'll be submitting a proposal to put money back in the pockets of Californians to address rising gas prices.
Joining us now to discuss the governor's proposal and more is Assemblymember James Gallagher, who was just named Republican leader in the Assembly. Mr. Gallagher joins us by Skype from Chico. Assemblymember, thank you for joining us tonight.
Good to be with you.
So tell us what you think of Governor Newsom's plan to propose a gas rebate of some sort and to skip the next annual gas tax increase.
Well, I mean, Republicans have a proposal that would actually give immediate relief. We have proposed a gas tax suspension that would save every consumer 50 cents a gallon right now. So we would really like to see that. We think that's the thing that would help people the most immediately. But we're open to talking to the governor. I guess the problem with the rebate is how long will that take, and how much would it be, and how much will that really help consumers? We want to ensure that this happens in a way that helps people get through these high cost times.
Does it seem unusual that you and the governor are perhaps at least walking in the same direction for a change?
No, I mean, look, we are always open to ideas that we think will help improve the quality of life. And the problem with the governor is that a lot of his policies have made the quality of life worse. We've seen skyrocketing inflation and costs. The homeless problem has gotten worse. Crime is on the rise. And we think we have better policies that will help ensure that every Californian can live in a safe and prosperous community.
I know you've both talked about where you'd replace the source of funding for either some sort of gas relief or for a gas tax repeal from this budget surplus. I want to turn to a different topic. You and 20 other lawmakers wrote a letter to the governor on Monday urging him to tap into California's natural resources. And in his State of the State address, Governor Newsom clearly stated he does not want to increase drilling for oil in California, saying that generally it leads to increased pollution and contributes to climate change, drought and wildfire. What's your argument for why we should grow our oil production here in the state?
Well, as somebody who represents Paradise and has seen everything that those folks have been through, that catastrophic wildfire was caused by PG&E and bad forestry policy, 40 years worth of bad forestry policy. So what we're talking about is just making sure that we're energy independent. We can, I think, have a variety of energy sources here that will also lead to cutting emissions overall. It's a balanced approach to our energy. And why not stop importing, our oil from places like Venezuela and Russia that have a really bad, human rights and environmental record? We can do things here that we think will help keep us energy independent. Also, will help create jobs, good blue collar jobs that Californians need, especially in these dire times.
And in the last few moments we have together, Assemblymember, a little later in the show, we're going to be speaking in depth about the housing crunch in California. What's the #1 reform you think should be put into place right away to provide more housing for people?
Reforming the California Environmental Quality Act. We've all seen that at UC Berkeley here recently. 3,000 students are being deprived of the ability to attend our premier state university because of lawsuit abuse under California Environmental Quality Act. So we need to make that change, and we need to do it across the board because there's housing projects across this state that are being challenged in an abusive way under CEQA. We need reform so that we can build more housing and ensure that everyone can have access to affordable housing in this state.
And as a reminder to our viewers, that is the California Environmental Quality Act. Assemblymember James Gallagher, we want to thank you very much for your time and your insight this evening.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
In his State of the State address this week, Governor Gavin Newsom acknowledged the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and expressed California's solidarity with the Ukrainian people. He also touted California's leadership on clean technology and recognized that while mask mandates and lockdowns during the pandemic were challenging, they also saved lives. And state budget analysts are anticipating an even larger budget surplus than originally predicted. Joining me now are KQED government and politics correspondent Marisa Lagos and KQED Morning Edition host Brian Watt. Thank you both for being with us here in studio.
Thank you.
So let's start by talking about the governor's State of the State this week. We just heard about the Republican response to that. Marisa, what stood out for you most about this speech?
Well, anytime a Democrat's talking about tax rebates, I think it's worth noting, and this was really the only news of the speech, the governor saying that he would like to take what is going to be probably a record surplus and put some of that back into the pockets of California drivers. As you noted, he's also saying that we're not giving up on climate change. This is not we're not moving backward, but obviously the people that are hurting most from this can afford it the least. And I think that that's a big thing that the governor and Democrats writ large are trying to kind of head off as we head into this midterm election year. Otherwise, Priya, it was very much a focus on the priorities he has had, including homelessness, including early education. And like you said, not a lot of news. We will know more in May when the revised budget comes out and the details of that tax rebate are actually unrolled.
Okay, and we also get a clearer picture of what that surplus looks like at that point.
Right.
So as we mentioned, the gas price is really impacting anybody who's driving a gas-powered vehicle right now in California, which is most of us. We know how it's sort of affecting people at the pump in general, but I'm curious about what's happening for rideshare drivers, for taxi drivers. Brian, you often take a rideshare into work for that early morning that you start for the morning anchoring of KQED's newscasts. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? Are those prices going up?
The price of a rideshare has stabilized really in the last few weeks. I have not seen it go up at all. And what's interesting is I will get in a Lyft early in the morning, and the first thing we will see are signs at gas stations where the gas prices have gone up from the day before.
That's right.
And it is the first thing that the driver will mention. And they say they're getting really no help from the companies. We actually spoke to a driver for Lyft and DoorDash that said we're not getting any help from the company, and this driver actually proposes just raising the base fare of the driver. Taxi drivers are going through the same thing. They think that the meter rates should be raised in this case to help with rising gas prices, but this is not something that you can just do. This actually has to be approved by San Francisco's Municipal Transportation Agency in the case of San Francisco taxi drivers. And so, they're really hoping for some relief.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how delivery prices may change as well as time goes on. Turning a little bit to the war itself in Ukraine, we are seeing so many horrific, tragic images come out of that country, and one that really, I think, took many of our breaths away this week was the photo of a mother and her 2 children who had been killed by mortar shells in Ukraine. And we found out that that woman was actually an employee of a Palo Alto startup, a tech company here. So many of us want to help. We want to find ways to be involved. Marisa, can you tell us a little bit more about, what California has put forward in the last week or so in terms of structured assistance to the Ukrainian people?
Right. So the governor did lay out an executive order where he essentially asked state agencies or ordered state agencies to ensure that their contractors are complying with all of those economic sanctions that the U.S. has placed on Russia. So the state itself is not necessarily doing, business with these countries, but they want to make sure that anyone they contract with is doing that. But to your point, I think that this is something that has touched so many people, and that average, citizens are just trying to get involved. I know, for example, refugee agencies and nonprofits that work with that population are gearing up for the possibility of an influx. But I also know people are just doing little things. One of our colleagues, Susie Rochow, a producer on the California Report magazine, held a bake sale to help fund food for Ukrainian refugees going into other countries. So I think a lot of people are just trying to, whether it's donate money or, raise money or reach out to groups that are assisting them. And I would really encourage people to do that, because it's going to take a global effort to help this just really sad refugee crisis and war that's unfolding.
Absolutely. Let's turn now to COVID news, which has dropped from the very top headline to a little further down, right? I mean, over the last few weeks, we're really seeing an opening up of our society, and this is the end this week of masking for students in schools. That's going to be changing as of next week. I know my kids are saying, what do I get to do? Do I get to take it off? Is that really going to happen? Brian, what are you hearing about how parents and teachers are responding?
Well, I think you have a lot of excitement and relief. I mean, masks are a tedious thing. It's really nice to not have to be worried about them. I think a lot of students are looking forward to seeing the faces and the smiles of their classmates, friends, maybe some crushes. And I think this is a really, really positive thing for a lot of students, especially some of the older students. But the younger students who might have factored masks into their regular school life for more of their education than the older ones are probably feeling some anxiety. We actually heard from a clinical psychologist this week who suggested that this anxiety is normal, perhaps a resistance to taking a mask off would be normal, and that this is a moment when we should all be checking in with our kids a lot about how they're processing this transition.
One last question here. Baseball, 99-day lockout, but we are back.
Yes.
Yeah. Baby, tell us all about it.
It's happening.
Well, it is happening. It's happening a good, 7 to 8 days later than expected. So this is a really, really good news. There are a lot of big things that came into this deal. Universal designated hitter, for baseball nerds. There's going to be an international draft, which is something that Major League Baseball has always wanted. They're going to expand the playoffs to 12 teams. This could mean something really huge when you think about the Giants-Dodgers rivalry.
I think we're going to have to follow you on Twitter for the rest of the details and also catch up on the school board recall race. Mayor Breed has just appointed 3 new people. Marisa, I'm sure you will tweet and share about that as well. In addition, next week, Marisa is going to be interviewing Governor Gavin Newsom on Forum on Wednesday, talking about care courts. So everyone should keep an eye out, an ear out for that. Marisa Lagos and Brian Watt, both with KQED, really want to thank you for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks.
We turn now to our special topic this evening, one that continues to be at the top of Californians' list of concerns: housing. The state needs millions of new housing units to catch up with decades of increasing demand, but construction is moving forward slowly. Meanwhile, the California Association of Realtors projects the median home price to rise 5% to $834,000 in 2022. KQED has taken an in-depth look at the housing crisis with a podcast series called Sold Out: Rethinking Housing in America. Currently, the show is in its 2nd season. The show is reported and written by KQED's housing affordability reporters, Molly Solomon, who is now joining us by Skype from Portland, Oregon, where she's currently traveling, and Erin Baldassari, who is joining us here in studio. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, Erin, we're going to start with you here. So on top of housing being incredibly expensive, as we just saw, there just isn't enough of it. And I know back in 2019, Governor Newsom had called for another 3.5 million housing units to be built by 2025. And that's fast approaching. So how is the state doing moving towards that goal?
Well, the short answer, Priya, is not very well. We haven't gone far enough. Since the governor was elected in 2019, there's been about 300,000 homes and apartments permitted across the state. But in order to reach that goal of 3.5 million, they would have needed about 5 times that amount.
Wow.
So, and that's just the number of homes being permitted. So just last year, for example, only about half the number of homes that were permitted were actually constructed. So it's no surprise that just last week, the state came out with a new goal, pushing that goalpost back quite a bit by reducing the number of units and extending the time to get there.
So now it's not 3.5 million anymore.
No, now we're looking at 2.5 million by 2030.
Okay.
But even that's going to be a stretch, and the state can't do it on its own. It's going to need local cities and counties to get on board. That means planning for where all of these new homes and apartments are going to be. And there's been a lot of resistance, but for its part, the state does seem like it's pretty serious about getting those local governments and holding them accountable. So it's threatening lawsuits and some pretty hefty fines if they don't follow through.
Molly, let's come to you here. At last count, there were about 150,000 people, a little bit more than that, experiencing homelessness in California. And in the first season of your podcast, Sold Out, you reported on Project Room Key, which housed many of these individuals and families in empty hotel rooms. So what ultimately happened with that program and with those people?
So the program, Project Room Key, is still running, although at a reduced capacity. Currently, there's about 9,000 hotel rooms being used to house homeless individuals and give them a place to self-isolate away from the streets and out of shelters. And that was really the goal of Room Key. It was always seen as this emergency response to the pandemic and more of a temporary program so that we could reduce the spread of coronavirus at a time where there was a great fear that it would spread like wildfire through these shelters, these crowded shelters and encampments,
right,
and harm the homeless population.
We saw some of that happen, yeah.
Exactly. And I would say that now the shift has really been toward turning some of those hotels and other sites into permanent homeless housing. And the state is calling that program Home Key. And that's where they've really invested a lot of their dollars toward building new homeless housing and converting some of those hotels, as well as we've seen really a diverse, there's been tiny home villages, apartment complexes that have been a part of this program, single family homes. They've even converted an office building into housing. And the state said that has resulted in 7,700 new units of homeless housing through this program. And they continue to put more money into it, about $2 billion to expand that.
Okay, so it seems like it is taking root and it is growing.
Exactly.
All right. What about the cost of housing here? Is there any progress that's being made in terms of making housing more affordable for people?
Yeah, there are a lot of factors that go into costs. Building materials, for example, and during the pandemic, the kind of inflation that we've been seeing certainly isn't helping. But, one of the other big factors is really supply. And for that, there is a little bit of help. There were 2 laws passed last year, SB 9 and SB 10, that both really look at trying to increase the supply of housing across the state. SB 10 would allow for streamlined approvals of small apartment buildings near transit and jobs, so that's fewer than 10 units. But far more controversial has been SB 9, and that's the one that would allow for up to 2 duplexes on properties in cities or suburbs where only 1 home is allowed right now.
So 2 duplexes meaning going from 1 property to 4.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, we have seen a trickle of applications, permits trickle in for projects like this around the state. But there's also been a lot of pushback from cities who just don't want to implement this new law. Woodside, California, for example, made headlines recently, saying that they were going to indefinitely delay implementation because they've declared their entire town mountain lion habitat.
We did talk about that here on a recent episode, and they backed down eventually, right?
Yeah, but I'm sure we're going to see other creative ways for cities to try to delay implementation. But look, even without the reticence that we see from cities, the experts that I've talked to say that this strategy of small infill developments is really just going to take years, if not decades, to meaningfully add to the supply of housing in California. So I, for one, wouldn't hold my breath for prices to come down anytime soon.
This season in Sold Out, it's your second season, and you decided to really focus on evictions. Why was that? Why did you target evictions specifically?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think the pandemic really just exposed how vulnerable people are to losing their homes. And, you know, when the economy shut down and people lost their jobs, the government did step in and banned evictions for non-payment of rent if there was a COVID-related hardship. And we saw that those protections really helped. You know, there was a study out of UCLA that looked at states where they had lifted those eviction moratoriums early, and they showed that that related to increased deaths and infections due to COVID. But, you know, here in California, Molly and I were hearing from our sources that despite all of these protections, people were still getting kicked out of their homes. And so we really wanted to understand that better in terms of where that was happening and who it was happening to.
Yeah, Molly, would you like to chime in here?
Sure. You know, I think that with eviction data in particular, there's a lot that we don't know. And we didn't really have a clear picture of how big the problem was or even where it was happening, you know, the worst. And so we started out by requesting sheriff lockout data, which is essentially any time that a sheriff is called out to enforce an eviction. And what we found is that these evictions weren't happening in the most expensive and the biggest cities in the Bay Area, like San Francisco. They were actually happening in outlying areas like Santa Rosa or in suburbs like Antioch, where we actually saw that the eviction rate was 22 times higher in Antioch than it is in Oakland.
And one of the things you found, perhaps no surprise at this point, is that the people who are being impacted, who are being evicted, tended to be people of color at much higher rates than white renters. So can you tell us a little bit more about those findings?
Yes, you know, we saw that in our eviction data that we were collecting in the Bay Area, and it's really a reflection of what we see nationally too, is that Black renters in particular are much more likely to be evicted than white households. In our data, we saw that it was sometimes 2, even 3 times more likely. There was a national report out of the ACLU that worked with folks at Princeton's eviction lab, and they showed that Black women in particular were at the highest risk of an eviction, and that it showed that they were more likely to be evicted at 2 times the rate than white renters. And, you know, some of this is economic. Black households are more likely to rent rather than own their homes. And when they do rent, they're more likely to pay a higher percentage of their income to that rent, and often don't have as much of a financial cushion to lean back on. And, you know, what we talk about and what we really dive into with our episode is that this is all part of a long legacy of racial discrimination that is rooted in our nation's housing policies. You know, it goes back to the New Deal and who we were, you know, allowing to get these favorable loans from the federal government. It goes back to redlining and really about who we have allowed in this country to accumulate generational wealth and build equity when it comes to housing, and who we've left out of that system, and how that's really still lingering today, and who is most likely to be evicted.
Well, I want to go back to the point that you were making earlier, Erin, about the protections that have been put in place for renters during the pandemic. Many of them have already expired, but are there any that are still in place at this point?
There are. So the eviction moratorium expired at the end of September, but there was a clause in there that allowed for tenants to remain protected if they're still waiting on rent relief. But what we've seen is that rent relief has been really slow to roll out, and that's leaving many renters vulnerable because those protections are expiring in just a few weeks at the end of this month.
Wow, so that's coming up quickly. All right, Molly, from your vantage point, and I'll come to you, Erin, as well on this, but from your vantage point as experts on this topic, what are the most important changes the state can make in order to solve the housing crisis?
Certainly, this is not going to be a silver bullet type of solution because it's not an easy problem to solve. And I would say the thing that we really looked at and highlighted in both seasons 1 and seasons 2 are the people that are trying to make that change happen. And we could do a lot to strengthen tenant protections moving forward, you know, not just when it comes to evictions, but when it comes to rent control and how high the rent can be brought up. And, you know, we're seeing a lot of that conversation start to happen more at the local city council level, which is really where a lot of this change needs to happen in those conversations.
And Erin, final thoughts here as we finish up this interview.
We need more housing that's affordable to folks, and that's going to go a long way into ensuring that people can stay stably housed. But as Molly was saying, you know, we can't just have more supply without also protecting tenants who are already here. because just building a bunch without protecting existing tenants is a recipe for displacement, especially in the short term. But look, we also have programs that are in place already, like rent relief. It hasn't been a perfect program. It hasn't been rolled out smoothly for sure, but we do have a structure in place. We can make it better, and that would go a long way to ensuring that one emergency, one unexpected medical expense, one job is not going to leave you homeless. And anything we can do to reduce the number of people becoming homeless in California would be a good thing.
All right. Erin, thank you so much for being on the show. Molly, you too. Erin Baldessari and Molly Solomon, they are KQED's housing affordability reporters. They're also the co-hosts of the podcast Sold Out. And if you'd like to ask Molly or Erin your own questions, please join us for a follow-up conversation on Twitter on Wednesday, March 16th from 12:30 to 1 p.m. Please join us. We turn now to something beautiful. Around the world, people have rallied in support of Ukraine. Tonight, we share a look at protests against the war from here in San Francisco. The music you'll hear accompanying these images is by Oakland-based folk group Kitka, singing a Ukrainian song. And that's the end of our show for tonight. Thank you for joining us. KQED Newsroom is on Twitter and Facebook. You can also email us at knr@kqed.org. And you can reach me on Twitter at Priya D. Clemens. We'll see you back here next Friday night. Have a good weekend.